Everyone knew Ethan was the class failure. Again, the exam results were posted on the old scratched whiteboard, and whispers floated through the crowded room like a cold draught. Names circled in red, scores that barely scraped passing. Ethan's was at the bottom once more. He stood near the back, shoulders slouched, avoiding eye contact. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his notebook, feeling the weight of every disappointed glance. Quiet and awkward, Ethan had fallen behind time and again, his failures stacking like bricks no one cared to knock down. This time felt different, though. The last chance was slipping away. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the restless classroom. The chatter slowly faded, replaced by the sharp silence that always came before something important was said. "Listen up, everyone," he began, his voice calm but firm. "This will be the final opportunity for those who haven't passed the course yet. I'm giving one last question, just one. Answer it correctly, and you pass. Fail, and, well, that's it." A ripple ran through the room. Some students exchanged surprised glances, eyebrows raised in disbelief. One girl whispered, "One question? Seriously?" A boy near the front scoffed, "Like anyone can pull that off now." The mood hung between hope and doubt, thick with uncertainty. All eyes eventually settled on Ethan. He felt every glance, piercing through him like needles. His heart hammered in his chest, a mix of anxiety and desperate hope stirring inside. Could this be the break he'd been waiting for, or just another trap set to confirm everyone's low expectations? He swallowed hard, his mind racing. One question, that's all? The thought was both terrifying and oddly freeing. No more endless exams or weekly quizzes, just a single chance to prove himself. But what if he choked? What if this was the moment he finally confirmed he didn't belong here? Memories flooded back, the whispered jokes, the teacher's sighs when he handed in late homework, the rows of red marks on his tests. Why do I always freeze when it matters? The fear was real, but beneath it, a stubborn flicker of hope ignited. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to show them all something they hadn't seen before. He glanced at Mr. Reynolds, whose steady gaze held no judgment, only expectation. The classroom felt colder, heavier, the seconds stretching longer than they should. The weight of that one question loomed over him like a mountain. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of doubt swirling inside. This was it, the moment between giving up and fighting back. Mr. Reynolds stood at the front of the room, his face serious but not unkind. There was something different in the way he looked at Ethan, not the usual frustration or disappointment, but something quieter, more thoughtful. The class noticed it too, and it unsettled them. Why did their teacher care so much about a student who had failed again and again? Ethan himself couldn't quite understand it. Every failed test, every missed assignment, every sigh of exasperation from Mr. Reynolds should have been the end of the road. Yet here he was, being given one final chance, one question that supposedly held the power to decide his future. The silence in the room deepened as Mr. Reynolds reached into a worn folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "This isn't just any question," he said, holding it up for all to see. "It's a question designed to test more than just memory or formula. It's about understanding, creativity, how you think when the answers aren't handed to you." His eyes locked on Ethan's for a moment, a silent message passing between them. The students exchanged doubtful looks. Most of them had memorized formulas, crammed definitions, and drilled past exam questions all year. This question sounded different, too different. "What's the point?" muttered someone from the back. "It's impossible." Another student shook their head. "Ethan won't get it, he never does." Ethan's heart sank. The words, the looks, they were like invisible chains tightening around him. Everyone expected him to fail again. The weight of their low expectations pressed down hard, threatening to crush what little confidence he'd managed to hold on to. But amidst the doubt, a spark flickered inside him. This question wasn't like the others. Maybe this was the moment. He could step outside the box, prove that he was more than a list of failed grades. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Why does Mr. Reynolds care? Ethan wondered again. This teacher could have given up on him months ago, like so many others. But no, instead, he was being pushed to think differently, to dig deeper. That was what made this question special. It wasn't just a test. It was a challenge, an invitation. Mr. Reynolds scanned the room once more, his gaze steady. "This question will decide more than your grade," he said quietly. "It will decide if you've learned to think for yourself." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Close-ups showed Ethan's face, pale and tense, eyes flickering with a mix of fear and determination. His breathing was shallow, his mind racing to prepare for what was to come. Across the room, the classmates' expressions hardened into skepticism, some even smirking in anticipation of failure. Mr. Reynolds folded the paper and began to read the question aloud. It was unlike anything the students had ever seen, a complex puzzle wrapped in layers of abstract thought. The room grew still. Even the loudest whispers fell silent. Ethan swallowed hard. This was no ordinary exam question. This was a test of everything he had yet to prove. The moments stretched taut, every heartbeat echoing louder than the last. And then the challenge began. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat and spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words. "Here is your question," he said, holding the paper so everyone could hear. "Imagine a river that never stops flowing, but the water you touch is never the same water twice. How do you define the river's identity when everything about it is constantly changing?" A few students exchanged puzzled looks. The question wasn't about numbers or formulas. It was a philosophical puzzle wrapped in a metaphor. Whispers rippled through the classroom. One voice muttered, "What kind of question is that for a math class?" Another snickered, "He'll never get this." Ethan's heart pounded. He wasn't sure if he understood the question fully, but something about it stirred his curiosity. The class grew louder, some mocking the idea, others shaking their heads as if the whole thing was a joke. Mr. Reynolds raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "This isn't about memorizing facts," he reminded them. "It's about thinking deeply, about identity, change, and what really defines something. Not just the surface, but the essence." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and strange. Ethan felt the weight of every eye on him, some filled with doubt, others barely hiding their amusement. He wasn't sure if he could answer, but for the first time, he wanted to try. This wasn't just a test. It was a chance to prove there was more to him than anyone believed. Ethan's mind raced as the question echoed in his head. A river that's never the same water twice. What does that even mean? He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the crushing weight of past failures pressing down like a stone. Memories flashed unbidden, the red marks on his first math test, the whispered jokes behind his back, the sighs of disappointment from teachers he had once hoped would believe in him. "You're going to fail again," a voice whispered inside. "You always do." But then another thought sparked, a tiny ember buried beneath the ashes of doubt. Maybe this isn't like the other questions. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a shaky breath. What defines a river if the water keeps changing? He pictured the flowing water he had seen on summer trips, always moving, never standing still, yet somehow still called the same river. Maybe it's not the water itself, but something else. The voices in his head battled, fear and hope, doubt and curiosity. "You can't do this," the fear said. "You don't belong here." But the flicker of determination pushed back. "Maybe I can," he thought. "Maybe this is the moment I've been waiting for." Ethan opened his eyes, looking at the paper again. The question was strange, but it wasn't impossible. It's about more than math. It's about thinking differently. His hands steadied. "I'm not just going to guess," he told himself quietly. "I'm going to explain what I think, even if they don't get it." For the first time in a long time, a cautious smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The doubt was still there, but so was a growing spark of hope. Ethan was ready to try. As Ethan slowly stood up, The classroom buzzed with a mix of reactions. A few students snickered openly, exchanging smirks. "He's going to make a mess of this," whispered one. "Watch him stumble," another added, barely hiding their amusement. The familiar chorus of low expectations wrapped the room like a heavy fog, but not everyone joined the mockery. A handful of classmates exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a quiet hope. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan could surprise them. One girl shifted in her seat, biting her lip as if willing him to succeed. Another nodded subtly, a silent encouragement in the sea of doubt. Mr. Reynolds remained still at the front, his expression unreadable but his eyes fixed firmly on Ethan. Beneath his calm exterior, a flicker of hope burned. He had seen something. In Ethan, long before the grades and failed tests, an unpolished potential waiting to be unlocked. This moment wasn't just about passing or failing. It was about recognizing growth and thought. The room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan cleared his throat and began to speak. The snickers softened into curious silence. Every word he spoke chipped away at the skepticism, building a fragile bridge of understanding. Some classmates exchanged surprised looks, eyebrows lifting as Ethan's thoughts unfolded with unexpected clarity. Yet a few still sat back, arms crossed, unconvinced. "Too little, too late," one muttered quietly, but the mood had shifted. The room was no longer a cage of mockery. It had become a space of possibility. Mr. Reynolds nodded slightly, a silent encouragement. The question was no longer just a challenge for Ethan, it was a lesson for everyone watching. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady but soft as he began. "Imagine a river," he said slowly, "like the ones I've seen back home during summer trips. The water flowing past your hand now isn't the same water that flowed a second ago. It changes every moment, yet we still call it the same river. So what makes it the river?" He paused, scanning the faces in the room, some still skeptical, others quietly intrigued. "It's not the water itself that defines the river," Ethan continued, "but the shape of its path, the banks that hold it, the way it moves through the land. The river's identity isn't in the individual drops, but in the pattern they create together over time." He took a step forward, warming to the idea. If everything about the river changes constantly, then maybe we need to look beyond what's immediate. The question isn't just about the water, it's about what holds it together despite change. The river is an idea, a flow, a story that continues. Ethan's words carried an unexpected weight, turning an abstract puzzle into something tangible, something real. "So," he said, "if we apply that to anything, maybe even ourselves, what makes us who we are if we're always changing, always learning, always moving?" A ripple passed through the classroom. Ethan wasn't reciting textbook formulas or definitions. He was asking questions, challenging assumptions about identity, permanence, and change. His answer wasn't simply right or wrong. It was thoughtful, layered, and meaningful. Mr. Reynolds' eyes softened, a subtle smile playing at his lips. The classroom had grown still, the usual chatter and whispers replaced by something heavier. Reflection. Ethan's heart raced, but for the first time, it wasn't fear. It was pride. He had taken the question and made it his own. And in doing so, he had shown something no grade ever could: insight. As Ethan finished speaking, a murmur began to ripple through the classroom. Not everyone was convinced. A tall boy near the front raised his hand and spoke sharply. "But that's just philosophy. This is a math class. How does that answer the question? You're avoiding the problem." Another student nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's too abstract. The river's made up of parts, so shouldn't the answer be about the individual elements, not some vague pattern?" Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the pressure rise. But instead of shrinking back, he squared his shoulders and replied, "I'm not avoiding it. I'm trying to explain that the question isn't about the parts alone. It's about how those parts connect and change together. You can't separate the river from its flow, just like you can't separate time from change." The room grew louder as voices began to overlap, some supporting Ethan's perspective, others pushing back. The debate had ignited, and the classroom buzzed with energy, part frustration, part curiosity. Mr. Reynolds raised his hand calmly, silencing the crowd. "Good," he said softly. "This is exactly what I wanted, to see you all think. Don't just look for one right answer. Question the question, challenge each other. Think beyond formulas and memorized steps." He turned slightly to Ethan and then the rest of the class. "Learning isn't about being handed answers. It's about wrestling with ideas, testing them, and growing in the process. Don't be afraid to explore different viewpoints." A student who had been skeptical earlier hesitated, then added, "So, there isn't just one correct answer." "Sometimes," Mr. Reynolds replied, "the value lies in how you approach the problem, not just the answer itself." The atmosphere shifted. The initial tension gave way to an open dialogue, with classmates asking questions, offering their own thoughts, and listening. Ethan felt the weight of judgment lift just a little. For the first time, he was part of the conversation, not just the punchline. Inside, Ethan's confidence grew. He realized this wasn't just about passing a test, it was about proving to himself that he could think deeply and hold his ground. And maybe, just maybe, the classroom was ready to see him differently too. As Ethan continued to speak, a quiet transformation took hold. The knot of anxiety in his chest began to loosen, replaced by a growing confidence he hadn't felt in years. Each word came more clearly now, his voice steadier, his thoughts sharper. He surprised himself, not just with what he was saying, but with how deeply he was able to explain the idea. He looked around the room and noticed the change. The sneers and smirks were fading. Eyes that had once bored into him with doubt now reflected curiosity. Classmates leaned forward, drawn in by his fresh perspective. Some nodded slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle they hadn't understood. Before, the girl who had quietly hoped for him earlier smiled, eyes wide with admiration. Even the students who had challenged him moments ago now listened with open minds, considering his words rather than dismissing them outright. Ethan's heart pounded, but this time with excitement instead of fear. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just trying to survive class. He was contributing. His ideas mattered. His way of thinking wasn't wrong. It was different, insightful, real. Mr. Reynolds watched with a subtle smile, his eyes shining with pride. The transformation wasn't just academic, it was personal. Ethan was stepping out of the shadow of past failures and into a new light. The classroom, once a place of judgment and doubt, had shifted into a space of possibility, and at the center of it all was Ethan, no longer the forgotten failure, but a student who dared to think beyond the expected. The moment hung there, fragile but powerful, as the class realized they had witnessed something rare, not just an answer, but a breakthrough. Mr. Reynolds took a slow, deliberate breath as Ethan finished speaking. The classroom held its breath, waiting for his verdict. Then, with a calm but warm smile, he said, "Ethan, what you've just shared is not what I expected. It's far better. You didn't simply recite facts or formulas. You understood the essence of the question. You challenged its assumptions and gave it new life." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "That is exactly what true learning is about." Turning to the rest of the class, he continued, "Too often, education focuses on memorization, on repeating what's been taught without question. But real understanding comes from thinking deeply, questioning, and connecting ideas to the world around us." Ethan's answer shows he's done just that. A quiet murmur spread among the students. Surprise, respect, disbelief. "Ethan," Mr. Reynolds said firmly, "you have passed this course, not because you memorized every formula or answered every previous question correctly, but because you've demonstrated insight and critical thinking. You've shown that learning isn't just about passing tests, it's about understanding." The room was silent. Then slowly, a few classmates began to clap. The applause grew, some hesitant at first, then genuine. Ethan felt a rush of emotion. Relief, pride, disbelief. For the first time, he wasn't defined by failure, but by the strength of his mind and courage to think differently. Mr. Reynolds gave him a nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement that this moment was about more than just one student. It was about what education could be, a place for discovery, for growth, and for unexpected brilliance. In that moment, Ethan and the entire class learned a lesson that no textbook could teach. For a long moment, the classroom was completely silent. The usual buzz of whispers and shifting chairs had vanished, replaced by a heavy stillness. The students sat frozen, processing what had just happened, the quiet victory of a classmate they had long dismissed. Slowly, murmurs began to ripple through the room. "Did you hear that?" one student whispered. "He actually passed. And not by memorizing." Another nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we've been looking at this all wrong." Some students exchanged glances, their expressions softening. The girl who had quietly rooted for Ethan smiled, her eyes shining with newfound respect. Even those who had mocked him before seemed to hesitate, their skepticism replaced by a flicker of doubt about their own assumptions. One boy, who had been one of Ethan's harshest critics, leaned back and muttered under his breath, "Maybe failing doesn't mean you're stupid. Maybe it means you just learn differently." The atmosphere shifted, subtle but profound. It was as if the classroom itself had been reshaped by what it had witnessed, a reminder that intelligence and understanding aren't always measured by grades or test scores. Mr. Reynolds watched the change quietly, knowing this was the real lesson, not just for Ethan, but for every student who had ever struggled or been judged too soon. As the murmurs grew into soft conversations about learning and growth, the class began to see failure not as an end, but as a step towards something greater. And for Ethan, that shift meant more than any passing grade ever could. Ethan sat quietly as the classroom slowly returned to life around him, but inside, everything had changed. The doubts that had once chained him down felt lighter now, replaced by a new kind of strength. Maybe failure isn't the end, he thought. Maybe it's just part of the journey, a chance to see things differently, to think differently. He realized that all those times he'd stumbled weren't signs that he wasn't smart enough. They were signs that he needed to find his own way, his own voice, and today, for the first time, he had. Creativity isn't just for artists or poets, Ethan mused. It's for anyone brave enough to question what they're told, to look beyond the surface. That's what real learning is about. He smiled softly, feeling a quiet pride bloom inside. The road ahead was still uncertain, but now he understood something important. Success isn't about never failing. It's about rising, thinking, and daring to be different. For Ethan, that was the real victory. Education isn't simply about passing tests or memorizing facts. It's about learning to think, to challenge what you're told, and discover your own perspective. True education encourages curiosity, creativity, and the courage to ask difficult questions. It's about finding your voice, even when it means standing apart from the crowd. Mr. Reynolds watched Ethan walk out of the classroom with a quiet smile. He wasn't just proud because Ethan had passed the course. He was proud because Ethan had grown as a thinker and as a person. The lesson today wasn't just about math or right answers. It was about unlocking potential and nurturing a mindset that values understanding over rote repetition. In that moment, Mr. Reynolds knew he had taught something far more important than formulas or theories. He had taught his students what it really means to learn, to embrace challenges, think deeply, and believe in themselves. And that, he realized, was the true purpose of education. Ethan gathered his things slowly, feeling a calm he hadn't known before. As he stepped toward the classroom door, his shoulders were straighter, his steps steadier. The eyes that once doubted him now followed with quiet respect. Outside, the hallway buzzed with the usual chatter, but Ethan heard it differently, as a world full of possibilities waiting to be explored. He paused for a moment, looking back at the room where everything had changed. A small smile touched his lips. This was just the beginning. The scene faded softly, the hum of hopeful music rising gently, carrying the promise of new beginnings and the courage to keep moving forward. Ethan walked into the light, ready to face whatever came next.